Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible. I'm William Bell, and we are delighted. With me is Don Preston from Preterist Research Institute, and everybody knows him on YouTube and on Facebook, and of course on just about every eschatology debate platform that he's allowed on, and that's not too many these days. At any rate, we are delighted to have him here and to be with you on this evening. It happens to be my birthday, so go ahead and sing to me, and I'll sit here and listen. Go ahead, Don.
William is so old he invented dirt.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was there when Adam was formed.
Trouble of it is, you're younger than me.
Yeah. So we're delighted to be here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I guess we both must be extremely tired because we're just cracking up here and saying all kind of crazy stuff. But we have a very, very serious topic we're going to be talking about in just a few minutes. I'm glad to see the weather changing a little bit, from all of the heat. It's getting just a little bit cool. I don't know how it is out in Oklahoma. Weather's always kind of strange out there, I guess you might say.
Yeah.
They go from tornadoes to blistering heat, to the Sahara Desert or something. So that's what it seems like. And then get hailstones as well. The book of Revelation must have been written out there, was it? Or did all that happen when you start writing your commentary?
Something like that, yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have a great show lined up for you tonight. We're going to be talking about Michael Hatcher and the passing of the law of Moses, of which I didn't get a chance to listen to, so Don has most of that information. But he and I have both written books on this subject. We have debated amillennialists before on the subject. And, of course, I just recently went back and painfully listened to a debate that I had with Steve Wiggins in 1994, all sessions of it, and, man, was it a pain to watch and to listen to. But at any rate, it just refreshed my mind on how many different positions have been taken on when the law of Moses was fulfilled by the amillennialists. And we'll talk about some of those. But Don has a couple of books that he's written. I know he has a debate, and I'm going to let him tell you about that in a moment. And also he has another book that he started, which is a series of books. And then I've written a couple of short books as well on the topic from a different perspective. And so I'm sure he probably covers that in his works, but of course mine were written from a different perspective and I think have an angle that is worth your having as well. So, Don, before we get into the subject, unless you have something else you want to talk about initially, why don't you tell them a little bit about the debate you had with Kurt Simmons on the law of Moses passing, and then also about the most recent book that you've written on the law, and update us a little bit.
Okay. Well, I did have a written debate with Kurt Simmons. Kurt Simmons once took the view that the law did not pass away until AD 70. He changed his views back to the standard amillennial view that the law passed away at the cross. He began making comments like Israel and the law of Moses were both nailed to the cross. That is, God's covenant relationship with Israel were nailed to the cross. And he began making comments about me teaching false doctrine, et cetera, et cetera. So we began to negotiate and finally had a written debate, which I then turned into book form. And it's called The Passing of the Law of Moses, AD 70, or At the Cross. It's available from my website. Then after that, I begin a series of books. The first is From Torah to Telos, The Passing of the Law. Passing of the Law of Moses, excuse me. It's volume 1. Now, I'm just finishing up, William and I were talking about it, I'm just finishing up volume 2, which is an in-depth study. In fact, I'm unaware of any other study that's anything like it on Daniel chapter 12. Now, this book, which is currently approximately 350 pages long, examines the text of Daniel 12 and examines the resurrection from the perspective of the passing of the law, but it examines the passing of the law from the perspective of the resurrection. Now, that's not a redundancy. Those are two different ways of looking at that text. And the premise or the question is, did Daniel chapter 12 predict the, quote, final resurrection, unquote? Did he predict the general resurrection? There are many partial preterists who have come to the view that Daniel chapter 12 was in fact fulfilled in AD 70. You know, there have been some radical conversions in the partial preterist world. Kenneth Gentry used to take the position that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, referred to the end of human history, the greatness of the Great Commission, a book that he wrote some years ago. Well, as a result of the full preterist demonstrating that verse 7 places the resurrection of Daniel 12 at the time of the destruction of the power of the holy people, Kenneth Gentry all of a sudden had an epiphany and discovered that Daniel chapter 12 was in fact a reference to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the spiritual resurrection of corporate Israel transformed into the body of Christ, which he stated in his, I believe it's his 2009 book, He Shall Have Dominion. So there's been a radical change within the partial preterist world from the once historical, once creedal view that Daniel 12 referred to the end of human history. Now all of a sudden they're taking a completely unhistorical, non-creedal view that Daniel chapter 12 refers to AD 70. And what's interesting about that, what's so fascinating about that, Sam Frost, who was once a preterist, wrote an article on Daniel chapter 12, and of course Sam Frost is now telling people that the creeds matter. The creeds are important. We have to go back to the creeds. And this is the Sam Frost who delivered some really fantastic lessons on why the creeds are not authoritative. Well, be that as it may, Sam Frost, in explaining his reasons for now rejecting Daniel 12 as a prediction of the general resurrection, closes out the article by saying, it should not bother us, should not worry us, should not disturb us. The early commentators missed this application. So here's a guy who tells anyone investigating covenant eschatology, hey, you can't do that. You can't go there because it's not creedal. So what does he do? He takes a position on Daniel 12 that's not creedal and says, hey, don't worry about it. Doesn't matter. The total inconsistency in the partial preterist world is absolutely stunning when you begin to read it. But anyway, that's a book I'm currently finishing up on. Lord willing, if I continue to make progress on it, it should be published early next year. That's my goal. That's my aim at this particular point. And it will be volume number 2 in my Torah to Telos series. So hope everyone will look forward to that.
Yeah, it's rather interesting that they have taken the position when they held to a future interpretation of Daniel chapter 12 that the creeds were right, and used that to, refute, or at least attempt to refute a 70 AD position on Daniel 12, and now, and stating that the creeds, were the authority, and now they have changed the position that they once argued for on behalf of the creeds, and as you say, I guess they say, well, it doesn't matter. So
yeah, it doesn't matter. It shouldn't bother us that the folks who made the creeds missed the point that they're now making. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. When that was the
point. And, of
course,
my response to that is, well, then it shouldn't bother us to take a position on the timing of the resurrection that the creedal fathers missed.
Exactly. So that is the case. Well, we're looking forward to those books being published. I did some time ago a book on Galatians 4, which I think is still a very critical and overlooked text, misapplied and abused text oftentimes when you're talking about the law. And, of course, we had some discussion about that since we've been doing these reviews on the Bellview lectures. But
yes,
it is a very, very powerful passage that demonstrates the coexistence of the two laws, and also the primary emphasis of the sons of Abraham, or being a son of Abraham, which of course is being the seed of Christ, was the inheritance, and that's what's pointed out there, and that's why that language goes back to Genesis 16 through 22, I believe it is, or somewhere about 21. But at any rate, that's a very important topic to get under your belt. And then the other was just a little short Kindle book that I wrote for the purpose of people basically to just have some scriptures ready at hand that they could use. A lot of times people want something that's quick, easy to use. I probably should turn it into a little paperback book, and they can use it as a tract for the most part on when the law of Moses was fulfilled. But that way they can easily access some verses when they're in the Bible study or want to teach a little class or something like that. They can do that. So that was the purpose of writing those. And
well, I keep waiting for you to reprint, to bring back your little book on the eschatology of the book of Galatians. As you indicated, I mean, it's just a fantastic little book. There was nothing else like it available anywhere. Since you first published that, there have been some major scholarly works that have come out that have touched on some of the points that you made in it. But that was, to me, that was just a really fantastic little book that people really need to have in their hands, because you brought out the synthetic harmony of the entire book of Revelation, as Paul's discussion of the contrast between the ages, the contrast between the covenants, and the centrality of understanding Galatians 4 properly in that discussion, and the importance of the doctrine of the inheritance. So when are you going to get busy and make it available?
Well, I tell you what, I definitely had been thinking about it, especially since I had learned a few additional things myself that I said, these need to be in the book. And, normally when I put something down, I'm like done with it. And, unlike, people who go back and continue to revise and improve, et cetera, I said, okay, look, I wasted blood over this before. I don't want to spill any more blood. But at any rate, I definitely see the need to bring it back and try to improve on it and enlarge it a little bit as well, because my views and understanding on the topic has enlarged, and there are some other things that can be pointed out. So thank you for the suggestion. I was already kind of nudged a little bit in that way, and I've just finished a couple of manuscripts that you've seen one of them on the regathering of Israel, or the regathering in Christ, I think it is.
Yes.
And so just touching that up, and then got to get a cover made for it, and then I'm going to send that baby off to the printer and see what happens with it. But I think it's a decent little study that needs to be out there as well.
Study. Yeah. Great study.
Okay. Well, we are into about 15 minutes of the broadcast, so why don't we go ahead and get down to some real business here. and start to talk about the passing of the law as was proposed by Michael Hatcher.
You know, I know that you didn't have the time to listen to it, William, but as he began his discussion, give me a moment to use my respirator, William, if you'll pick it up there.
Sure, no problem. All right, but I'm sure that as we cover this subject, it's going to be some of the same things that we've heard over and over and over again and that we continue to hear. And it's going to expose some of the dichotomization, and you might say, you know, it's more than just dichotomies that they have, because during the time that I debated Steve, Jack Scott debated him in 1993. Stephen Wiggins is who I'm talking about. Jack Scott debated him in 1993, and then I debated him in November of 1994. In the debate that I had with him, I think he took 3 different positions on the end of the law in that one debate, and that was in addition to, I had forgotten that he had even taken that one of those positions, but that was in addition to the position he had taken with Jack in Montgomery, where he had discussed the law ending at the end of time. But anyway, I'm sure some of that's going to come up as we cover the topic. Are you recovered, Don?
Well, I don't know how much I've recovered, but at least I got a shot of my respirator.
Okay.
My allergies have just been raging the last few days. They tell us over here in southern Oklahoma that the pollen count for ragweed and mountain cedars is just, it's just off the chart. Anyway, what I started to say was that Michael Hatcher began talking about dispensations. Now, William, you and I both know we've encountered it repeatedly. Stephen Wiggins appealed to it. Bill Lockwood in my debates with him appealed to it. Is these brethren say you cannot have 2 laws existing at the same time. You just can't do it. Well, now, I didn't listen all the way through to the end of his presentation. I too was busy, just like you. I only got to the point where he got to Romans chapter 7, and I ran out of time. But believe me, we've got plenty to talk about. He, one of those types of situations where he put out enough error in the first 15, 20, 23 or 4 minutes of his lesson that it would take 2 or 3 weeks to correct all of the error. I'm not trying to be unkind, but that's just how bad his presentation was, and especially how bad it is when you compare with what some of the other speakers said on that lectureship. Now, several of the other speakers that we've already examined said you cannot have 2 laws in existence at the same time. That would be spiritual adultery. So I'm sitting here listening to the very first of Michael Hatcher's presentation. And Michael Hatcher is not a dummy by any stretch of the imagination. Michael has always been, in what little correspondence I've had with him, he has seemed to be at least somewhat level-headed. But if you see the train coming about the argument about you can't have 2 laws existing side by side, and you know that that's an objection that these brethren have against covenant eschatology, then for Michael Hatcher to begin as he did, I sit there just shaking my head going, really? You're going to start like this in an argument on the passing of the law? Okay. William, he started off and he says, God has always dealt with man in dispensations. And he said the word dispensation means to dispense. And that means this is the way God has dispensed his law. And he says biblically, there have been 3 dispensations. There has been the patriarchal, the Mosaic, and the Christian. Now, I want to give this little caveat for objectivity and honesty and integrity's sake. Up to the point that I've listened so far, which is to his introduction of Romans 7, he has not introduced the idea you can't have two laws at the same time. But, William, you and I both know, in his argumentation on Romans 7, he's going to make the argument you can't have two laws in effect at the same time. That's part and parcel of what we will call the AD 33 doctrine, brethren, in their arguments against covenant eschatology. So, I sat and I listened to him, and he goes, you know, you got your patriarchal age, and you got your Mosaic age, and you got your Christian age. Now, William, I've got a question for you. Michael Hatcher says God at one time was dealing with mankind under the patriarchal dispensation. So, William, so far as the biblical record is concerned, during the patriarchal system, was God dealing with all of the heads of all of the families in the exact same precise way?
The answer to that is no. If you mean all the way, do you mean all the way through the patriarchal system?
Exactly.
No.
In other words,
not.
let's just talk about Abraham. Did God deal with the heads of the families of everyone else other than Abraham in the same way that he was dealing with Abraham?
No.
Okay. Then during the patriarchal system, patriarchal dispensation, God had one way to deal with Abraham and another way to deal with those who were not in Abraham's family. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So here we have the patriarchal system, and you have two, quote, systems in effect at the same time. Is that not true?
That's right.
Okay. So here is Michael Hatcher, who leads off his presentation. And he's going to, if I were a betting man, and I'm not, but if I were a betting man, I'd say when he comes to Romans chapter 7, he's going to make the argument, you can't be married to two laws at the same time. Well, I'm going to, who's denying that? That's not what we who espouse covenant eschatology teach. And we deny that doctrine from Romans chapter 7, the very passage that Michael Hatcher was going to. My point is this. If and when Michael Hatcher says you cannot have two laws in effect at the same time, he then started out his presentation by talking about the patriarchal system. And under the patriarchal system, God dealt with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in one way, in a favored way, in a distinctive way, and in an exclusive way, in a way that he never dealt with the heads of the families of anyone from, let's say, South America or North America, if there was even anyone here or there. But you get the point. So here are two systems, two ways of dealing with man that were synchronous with one another at the same time. And then Michael Hatcher talks about, you see, when you had the patriarchal age, then you had the Mosaic age. And guess what Michael Hatcher says? He tells us that the law of Moses only for Israel. It was not for all men. Well, William, if the law of Moses was not for all men, then what were those not under the law of Moses? What system were they under?
They certainly were under a law to God, because both Old Testament and New Testament teaches that. They were under the patriarchal system, for sure.
Wait. Oh, wow. So you have the Mosaical age going on, in which you have a codified law given to Israel and Israel only. And then you have the patriarchal age, which is not the law of Moses, but it's law, just like you said. It's most assuredly law given to the patriarchs. Well, William, isn't that two laws in effect at the same time?
It most certainly is.
So here's Michael Hatcher, who I feel more than confident, when we listen to the rest of the presentation, is going to tell people you cannot have two laws in effect at the same time. But he begins his entire presentation by saying, well, you had the patriarchal system. Well, under the patriarchal system, God dealt with the heads of certain families, and he did not deal with the heads of other families in the same identical way. Therefore, you had two systems in effect at the same time. Then he tells us that there's a Mosaic law. And Michael Hatcher says it was only for Israel. It was not for all men. But those outside the Mosaic law were under law. Therefore, you had two laws in effect at the same time. William, you and I both have had countless discussions with people on this very issue, and invariably, someone, metaphorically speaking, sometimes literally, gets in our face and say, you can't have two laws in effect at the same time. And when you point out the very things that we've been discussing right here, all of a sudden, it's like they hear their mother calling them. They got to go home. They don't have time to play anymore. It's just amazing how people can, when they're attempting to refute something, and especially something that they're absolutely not well versed in. And it's, William, is it not a fair assessment? Is it a fair statement to say that up to this juncture, of the men that we've listened to, the men that we've critiqued their lessons, not one of those men had a fair, objective, comprehensive understanding of covenant eschatology? Is that an accurate statement to say in your view?
That is pretty accurate. That's very accurate. As a matter of fact, it appears to me that most of them were just trying to make sure they remained in step with status quo and with each other.
Well, that's most assuredly my impression. I have not heard anything from a single speaker that made me go, well, hey, guess what? Thank you very much. At least you seem to have read some of the literature. Now, in Michael Hatcher's speech, he referenced Max King, and he referenced me. Now, didn't quote us, but at least they referenced us. Most of the men didn't even do that. They just said, these Kingites believe, these realized eschatologists believe, and then they'd proceed to say something that as we sit and listen to what they claim that we believe, we're going, no, we don't. Where did you get that? So it's been really, really upsetting to listen to these men who pretty clearly, pretty obviously, have not read, have not spent time and energy in actual research in the literature of the full preterist view. As we have said before, it has every appearance in the world that they've read someone's book like Wayne Jackson or Terry Varner or Curtis Cates, none of whom have read the literature extensively, none of whom have read the literature objectively. They do not understand substantively what we are saying, or they know that we say Christ came in AD 70. Beyond that, their understanding of covenant eschatology is superficial at best. And that's what it appears even in Michael Hatcher's beginning presentation here, or the beginning of his presentation. It's just, you just sit and you listen and you go, do you not hear what you are doing to your own theology I see the train coming. I see what you're going to argue down the road about two covenants. But in your opening comments about the patriarchal age, the Mosaic age, and the Christian age, you are laying the foundation for destroying your own argument. And these men haven't thought past their nose in their argumentation. Now, it's interesting to me, William, that he made the comment, you have to keep in mind the Mosaic age was always supposed to end. Well, then he talks about the Christian age, and it's the last dispensation. And conveniently, Michael Hatcher completely omits what the Bible has to say about the duration of the new covenant. William, why don't you share a few thoughts with us on that aspect of it? Are you there, William?
My mic was turned down to avoid any distraction. Okay, so on the duration of the new covenant?
Yes, indeed.
Of course, we have the statement in Isaiah, both actually in Daniel and Isaiah. If you look in Daniel tells you, and this is the passage that is quoted, so often. It's the one that we cut our eye teeth on when we started preaching, and talking about the church. Was Daniel 2:44 and 45 that talks about the God of heaven would set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed and that it would stand forever. So here we have a text that actually states that the kingdom, when it's established, and of course there is, some discussion over the term established and really understanding what that means. It doesn't just mean to bring it into existence, but it means to bring it to a point where it stands and is able to, or has defeated all of its enemies, where it's able to stand on its own without the aid of anything else, and is solid and sure. It's basically what the word means. And so we have the establishment of the kingdom. But at any rate, he said it would stand forever. Now, along with that, you have Isaiah 9 and verse 7, which is another very interesting text. And, it's almost amazing to hear this text quoted and used so often by those who want to talk about the duration of the covenant and the kingdom, etc. But, he says, of the increase of his government and peace. And you remember when in our debate with Stephen Wiggins, he defined that. He used, I believe it was Arden Gingrich's lexicon, and he used the very term to define dispensation to talk about the way God governs his affairs. Well, the way he governs his affairs was the kingdom, or the gospel rather. And, of course, the Bible talks about the gospel of the kingdom, but here we have the increase of his government, so that would be the gospel, and that gets us back to the new covenant. But he says of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with just judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. And then we have, of course, in Ephesians chapter 3. This was the statement in your debate that Bill Lockwood, who was Steve's partner and moderator, in crime, so to speak. But at any rate, the text was, unto him be glory in the church by Christ Jesus throughout all ages, world without end. Amen. And as you have stated, and, as documented in the writings of F.F. Bruce, this was one of the strongest constructions in the Greek for endlessness that we have in the New Testament. So we have these passages that say that it would have no end. And, of course, Hebrews, if you study Hebrews 7 through basically the end of the book for the most part, it talks about the covenant. It talks about the priesthood of Christ. It talks about the reason the old covenant would not continue, in contrast to why the new covenant would. And so because Christ lives forever, he has an unchangeable priesthood, and the covenant is built upon or based upon the foundation of priesthood, Hebrews 7:11 and 12. So there are just numerous examples in the New Testament that demonstrate that the new covenant would continue forever. And, of course, you always have Matthew 24 and verse 35. Heaven and earth would pass away, speaking of, the temple and the old Jewish system, but my words will never pass away. And Peter cites that same text, which he's, quoting from Isaiah, but cites that same text in 1 Peter 1, and he talks about the incorruptible seed, the word of God, which lives and abides forever. And he says, this is the word which by the gospel has been preached to you. So in every one of those passages, we encounter statements that say that the new covenant has no end and would continue forever, world without end.
William, something is interesting here, and this came up in my debate with James Jordan some years ago. James Jordan went back through the Old Testament, pointing out how this civilization fell and their heaven and earth was destroyed, and this one fell, their heaven and earth was destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. And he made the comment that the reason all of these previous heavens and earths came to their end is because they could never accomplish what they were intended to accomplish, because they were weak, because they were sinful, because they were failures. Mm-hmm. And then he talked about the ultimate end of the Christian age. And I got up and I posed the question, okay, if all previous heavens and earths, i.e. the law of Moses, the heaven and earth of Israel, if it came to an end because it was weak, because it could not overcome sin, because it could not overcome the curse, therefore it had to come to an end, then why must the new covenant age of Jesus Christ come to an end? If it is your principle that a system, i.e. the Mosaic Law, would come to an end because of its weakness, because of its ineffectiveness, because of its inability to deliver man to righteousness and to life, then why in the world does the new covenant of Jesus Christ have to come to an end? Now, by the way, he never answered that. And we could pose the same identical question to Michael Hatcher. Why was the law of Moses supposed to end? Well, he would point us without any doubt whatsoever to Galatians 3:20 and 21. If a law could have been given that could have given life, then verily righteousness would have been through the law. Okay, the old law could not deliver life or righteousness. That same book, Paul says, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 10, those who are under the law are under a curse, as it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things that are written in the book of the law to do them. That old law had to come to an end because it could not give life and righteousness, because it was weak. It was a law that condemned. It was a ministration of death. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. Okay, the law of Moses had to come to an end because of its weakness, because of its inability to give that which was needed and desired. Then why in the world does the new covenant age have to come to an end? I mean, that's a self-entrapping argument. Well, it really shouldn't surprise us that these brethren self-entrap themselves, though they have a real good way of doing that every time they open their mouth. So, but anyway, those are some of the things that struck me, William, when Michael Hatcher began his presentation, pointing out you got the patriarchal, you got the Mosaic, and you got the Christian. You got the patriarchal age, but of course, Hatcher did not point out that God dealt with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in a way different from the heads of the fathers of all the other houses. He just simply said, then you got the Mosaic law. Now, he did not say, I did not hear him say, that the patriarchal age came to an end when the Mosaic age came. You know, William, if he takes the position that two laws cannot be in existence at the same time, he would have to argue that all men were under the Mosaic law. But he explicitly says, no, it was given only to Israel. It was not given to all men. Therefore, logically, he has to have the patriarchal age, patriarchal dispensation, in effect at the same time as the Mosaic age, thus negating any argument that he may make on Romans chapter 7, when I listen to that for next week, about you can't have two laws in effect at the same time, which is exactly precisely what some of the other men on that lectureship have argued. You just can't do it. That's spiritual adultery, we have been told by other men on that same lectureship. William, this was in the first 10 minutes of his presentation, in which he discussed the patriarchal, the Mosaic, and the Christian age. He entrapped himself. He entrapped the other speakers on that lectureship by laying out for us the patriarchal, the Mosaic Christian age, although, once again, I want to be fair here, he did not elucidate and explicate what happened under those systems, but we all know what he himself believes about it. And he did say Mosaic age, Mosaic law, was not given to all men. Okay, you got two laws in effect at the same time. You got the patriarchal system, the patriarchal dispensation, which is the way of God dispensing his law. Okay? Two laws in effect at the same time. You know, we hadn't even talked about John the Baptizer. But you got, you know, when you talk about two laws in effect at the same time, you got the Mosaic law in effect at the temple when John came. Then you have John coming along, preaching something brand spanking new that was not part and parcel of the Mosaic law at the temple. Isn't that two laws? Isn't that two, quote, dispensations at work at the same time? And, oh, by the way, for the same identical people? Is that not right, William? Am I off base here?
No, that's definitely correct. You're right on point. I wanted to go back to just one point you made earlier, though, when you quoted from Galatians, and you pointed out the text, you know, if there could have been a law which have given life, verily righteousness would have been by the law. Well, the very fact of that statement was indicative of the fact that with the law there was death. So if the new covenant does not continue, the net result is that it is a covenant of death. Because that was the only reason the old one didn't continue, was because it couldn't give life. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Powerful point.
So it would turn the new covenant.
They would offer the caveat that say, no. The end of the new covenant age is resurrection life. Well, isn't life under the new covenant resurrection life? And they would go, yeah, sort of, kind of, but not really, because they would go to Romans chapter 6. Do you not know that so many of us, as were baptized into Christ, were baptized into his death, that like as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life? And they would argue that's resurrection life right there. That's resurrection life. Death, burial, resurrection to a new life. And we would go, amen to that. That's resurrection life under what? The new covenant. And yet they would then say, oh, but that's not the real resurrection life. So they dichotomize between what had begun there in the first century, what was taking place in the first century, and what was to be consummated at the end of the age. What was to be consummated? Resurrection life that was guaranteed through the earnest of the Spirit, according to Ephesians 1:12 and 13. It's just amazing. Okay,
yeah, it definitely is.
I'm sorry. He comes to Matthew 5:17 and 18. And he says, one of the key arguments these guys use is Matthew 5:17 and 18. And William, he spends 3 or 4 minutes talking about it, and I'm sitting there going, amen, preach it, Brother Hatcher. You're doing a great job. Because he's going, these brethren go there, and they say, see, Jesus said I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And these brethren say, therefore, until all of the law is fulfilled, it could not pass away. And I'm going, that's exactly what we do say. And Jesus said, until heaven and earth passes away, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law, until it's all fulfilled. And he said, these brethren say that the law itself, every single jot and every single tittle, even of the prophets, had to be fulfilled before it could pass. And I'm going, that's right. That's right, Brother Hatcher. And he goes, now that statement, until heaven and earth passes away, he said, what that really means is that the law is as firm as heaven and earth. Well, that's such a self-entrapping argument, but that's not what I want to get to here. So, I kid you not, William, had you listened to his simple explanation of what we believe, there he stood doing nothing but quoting the verse and saying, this is what these brethren believe. And I'm going, yep, that's us. Guilty as charged. And then he goes, but this gets these brethren into trouble. This destroys their own doctrine. I'm going, well, okay, that's an interesting claim to say that we accept the text as it reads and we emphasize it, and that supposedly destroys our doctrine. This ought to be really good. So here's what he said. He called attention to Micah chapter 3, verse 12. And he said, I want you, brethren, to pay attention to this. In Micah chapter 3 and verse 12, it said, Jerusalem shall be plowed as a field. And he said, this was rather remarkable. Now, I know that there was an immediate, imminent application to the Assyrian, or to the invasion at that time, Babylonian. But he goes, this passage is applied to AD 70 by these brethren. And he said, and I must confess, William, it's just painful to listen to such claims and the overt ignorance. I use the term kindly, but properly. He says the trouble with this, with the covenant eschatology, he didn't even use that term. The trouble with these folks that believe and realize eschatology is that Jerusalem was not plowed like a field in AD 70. And I sat there and I thought, really? Now, William, I'm going to draw up from my files. I don't want to, pardon me, I don't want to quote this, but I want to read some notes from my files taken from Eusebius, who is called the father of church history, in his work entitled Proof of the Gospel, Book 8, Chapter 3, page 140 and following. He quotes from Micah chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, chapter 3, 9 to 12, the very passage that Michael Hatcher refers to, and Micah 4, 1 to 4. Now, just hang on to that for a moment and let me continue with what Michael Hatcher said. He said, Jerusalem was not plowed as a field until the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 AD. So he said, if these brethren hold on to their view of Matthew 5, 17 and 18, that until every jot and every tittle is fulfilled, the law does not pass away, then they've got to say that the law didn't pass away until 132, 135. Well, let me tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, that's not William and my problem. That would be his problem. Because Jesus did say, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it is all fulfilled. Now, I can already tell we're not going to have time to finish all of Michael Hatcher's presentation on the passing of the law, but I really, really want to get to this. So here is Michael Hatcher, who says, Micah chapter 3 and verse 12 is incorrectly and inappropriately applied to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. He says Jerusalem was not plowed like a field until 132 to 135 AD, at the end of that Bar Kokhba revolt. Well, I referenced a moment ago Eusebius, 4th century church historian. Let me say this again. In his book, Proof of the Gospel, Book 8, Chapter 3, page 140 and following, he references specifically and precisely Micah chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, Micah chapter 3, verses 9 to 12. That's the passage Michael Hatcher says was not fulfilled until 132, 135 AD. But commenting on Micah 1, 2 through 4, which talks about God coming down out of heaven, treading on the tops of the mountains melting under his feet, he said the Lord came in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Furthermore, he says that the time when men would not take up sword against one another anymore, when every man would, quote, have his own fig tree according to prophecy, and that's the prophecy of Micah 4, 1 to 4, had been fulfilled. He quotes verbatim from that prophecy of the coming of the Lord out of heaven of Micah 1, 2 through 4, and said that occurred with the fall of Jerusalem. He then cites Micah's prophecy that Jerusalem would be plowed like a field, and he said he had seen it with his own eyes. Now, one might say, oh, well, he's referring to Jerusalem that had been plowed up in 132. But in his application of Micah 1 and in his application of Micah 4, he referred them to AD 70. He did not refer them to the Bar Kokhba revolt. So in order for Michael Hatcher to be sustained, he's got to lift Eusebius's references to AD 70, got to lift them out of there, set them aside, and say that Eusebius was actually referring to 132 and 135 in that single text. But it's not contextual. It is not contextual at all. As far as Eusebius was concerned, and by the way, Eusebius does, in other passages, he does talk about the Kokhba revolt, but he's not talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt in this text. Thus, Michael Hatcher has to be guilty of eisegesis in order to get it in there. Not exegesis, but eisegesis. And that's a pretty sad thing to do, and it just demonstrates the desperation of these men, you know, that are just, they're hoping somehow, some way to find something that they can hold on to and throw out there to find some chink in the armor of covenant eschatology. And look, you know, William, you've done it. I've most assuredly done it. We've made arguments before that did not stand up under closer examination. That's just the nature of human beings. That's the way we are as human beings. But that doesn't mean the paradigm is wrong. That doesn't mean the framework is wrong. And so when Michael Hatcher jumps up and makes these bold claims about Jerusalem wasn't plowed like a field until 132 to 135 AD, and yet Eusebius, in a context of discussion about AD 70, speaks of Jerusalem had been plowed like a field. You got a problem with your claims about the Bar Kokhba revolt. I mean, this is just one of those areas, and his whole point, you see, turns against him, because he says, well, if these realized eschatologists are true, and the law could not pass until it was all completely fulfilled, and if Jerusalem wasn't plowed like a field in fulfillment of Micah until 135, then that means the law continued until then. Let me say again, folks, that becomes Michael Hatcher's problem. That's not ours. That's his. And then, we'll close on this. William, he did appeal to Daniel 2:44, and how this stone cut out without hands would crush and destroy all of the other kingdoms, and that would include the Roman Empire. And he says, well, the Roman Empire wasn't destroyed until 476 AD. And therefore, you have the law continuing until 476 AD. Well, once again, folks, that's his problem. That's not ours. But he's misapplying the language of Daniel 2:44. William, would you like to comment on that and bring us down to the close of our show?
Sure. So, we've been talking about, and mostly you've been talking about, the passing of the law and Michael Hatcher's position on that. We started out talking about the dispensation, which he introduced his lesson with, and to state that God could not have two laws in existence at the same time, and the very concept that he cited, and even the illustration to which he went in that analogy was, back to the time of Abraham, and there we have, lo and behold, Abraham in an exclusive law relationship with God, a codified law where he's been called out from the rest of the patriarchs, is given instructions, even has has circumcision, where God says whoever does not obey that will be cut off from the people, and therefore another indication that there is a distinction being made between Abraham and those outside of that covenant relationship with him. And yet that's all going on at the same time, and that continued all the way up through Christ. And so you had these two covenants existing. And so it is not a solid position, not a sound position to argue that you cannot have two covenants in view at the same time. And as you said, we'll cover some more of that in next week in Romans chapter 7. And then we talked about the endlessness of the new covenant and why it could not end. One, Christ has an unchangeable priesthood. The Bible says it has no end, uses the strongest terms we have in the Greek language, according to renowned scholar F.F. Bruce, that Ephesians 3:21 means endlessness. The reason the old covenant didn't continue was because of the fact that it could not produce life, and of course the new covenant does produce life. And so these were, just some of the things that were touched on tonight, and we're going to cover them again on next week and deal with them to further clarify, explain, and share on why the law of Moses did not end at the cross, but continued. We talked, of course, in Matthew 5:17 and 18, particularly about the heaven and earth passing away, and every jot and tittle had to be fulfilled before that law could pass. We're just about out of time now. We are going to pick this up on next week, but I want to thank Don for sharing this information with us and bringing us to this point. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to say have a very wonderful evening, and until next time, may God bless you, and we will see you on our next broadcast on Two Guys in the Bible, right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Good night, and God bless. Thank you for joining the Two Guys in the Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say, have a very pleasant day, and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.